this presentation, I'm going to discuss social inequality in mandatory detention around Australia, which is one of the major human rights issues within Australia. Mandatory detention is the practice of compulsory detaining or imprisoning people who seek political asylum. While Australia is not the only country to detain unauthorised immigrants in certain circumstances, Australia is known to be the only country where asylum seekers must be detained in detention centres such as Christmas Island, Papua New Guinea, and many more other islands off the coast of Australia. Mandatory detention in Australia has been a human rights issue since 1992, when mandatory detention became a law during the Howard government under the Migration Reform Act of 1992. The current situation today is if asylum seekers arrive in Australia without authority by boat, are then detained and transferred to a detention centre while their reasons for coming to Australia is identified by the Australian government. While the asylum seekers are held in detention, an initial health check, identify and security checks are conducted, and once they pass those checks, the Australian government will grant them a bridging visa to allow them to enter the country while their application is being processed for a permanent visa. However, whilst on a bridging visa, asylum seekers have strict conditions such as not being able to access government housing, no access to financial support from Centrelink, and they must report to the Department of Immigration on a regular basis. The only way for an asylum seeker to get out of detention is either for the government to grant them a visa or they leave the country. The rules of detention are different if the asylum seeker is lawful but non-citizen as opposed to unlawful but non-citizen. Unlawful non-citizens are asylums who arrive by boat without documentation, whereas lawful non-citizens are asylums who arrive by plane with documentation. The asylums who arrive by plane with documentation are able to avoid detention and are not classified as a security or health risk to the community as opposed to those who arrive by boat. Asylums who arrive by plane are granted a bridging visa and therefore are allowed to enter the country while their application is being processed. There are different detention facilities around Australia. Each facility is used for different purposes depending on what each asylum circumstances are, and everyone is treated differently. Australia has got standard detention whereby people are detained indefinitely. This applies to people with visa overstays, breach of visa conditions, or an arrival without a visa. Secondly, there are immigration residential housing, where they have lesser security restrictions, which gives the asylums more flexibility in terms of domestic activities. This is mainly for accommodating families. For asylums who are leaving the country or transferring between facilities, the detention facility is called transit accommodation, which is for people who pose minimal risk to the community. The government also uses alternative places for detention such as correctional centres, hospitals, hotels, psychiatric facilities, and many more. They are mainly for children, families, and people in need of medical treatment. Immigration detention affects some people in society. Firstly, we have the asylum seekers who are greatly affected by the social inequality and the idea of mandatory detention. Asylums in detention are on a bridging visa are greatly disadvantaged financially and experience poor living conditions. This is because the conditions of a bridging visa doesn't allow individuals to work, which then affects asylums' ability to own houses or have somewhere to live, as the government will not provide government housing. Not only does it affect asylums from a living perspective, but it also affects them mentally, especially whilst in a detention centre. Detaining immigrants leads to mental illness such as anxiety, depression, or even suicide in worst cases. This is due to a number of possibilities such as past living conditions, uncertainty as to whether the Australian government will grant them a visa, being locked up for months on end, and many more. Some individuals are singled out as the government provides better accommodation to families and children, and which then causes frustration and anger amongst the individual asylum seekers. As you can see on the graph, from October 2009 to May 2011, it is recorded that over 300 actual self-harm incidents occurred within immigration detention centres around Australia. Referring to the same graph shows other incidents that are caused by anger and frustration amongst individual detainees. Even though some people may think that detention just affects asylum seekers, the reality is that it actually affects other people in society, such as government departments. The Australian government has to put money into these detention centres to keep them open, just as it costs money to run a correctional centre. The Australian government spends hundreds of millions of dollars for unnecessary costs by detaining vulnerable people. As discussed earlier, detention contributes to mental illness on detainees, which dramatically affects on other services such as counsellors, police, and medical services. As you can see here in the picture below, there is a riot from one of the detention centres in Sydney and from the Daily Telegraph. Mandatory detention in Australia has many social inequalities, which are shown in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In referring to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there are 7 out of 30 articles that Australia does not follow within immigration detention. The list of articles breached include: we are all free and equal. Asylums who arrive on plane with documentation are not detained and are granted a bridging visa, whereas those who arrive on boats are detained. The right to live. We all have the right to life and live in freedom safely. Some asylum seekers come to Australia simply because of war and political conflict, which makes their own country unsafe. Immigration detention denies asylums this right. We are all equal before the law. Unfortunately, in Australia, there are different policies depending on the person. Within immigration detention, the law is not equal between lawful and unlawful non-citizens. The law also shows social inequality, as people on bridging visas aren't allowed to work as opposed to others who live in Australia. If asylums are caught working whilst on a bridging visa, they are sent to a detention centre. 4. No unfair detainment. Within Australia, immigration detention, people are detained for reasons such as wanting to live in a peaceful place, working to earn money, and breaching of simple conditions that don't apply to lawful citizens. Some asylums are even detained indefinitely. Freedom to move. We all have the right to go where we want in our own country and travel as we wish. Mandatory detention highlights a major human rights issue, as people who arrive in Australia have the right to travel to another country for their safety. However, instead of they are locked up by the Australian government until they are granted a visa, or they must return to their own country. This also covers the article from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right to seek a safe place to live. And lastly, workers' right. Every grown-up has the right to do a job to a fair wage for their work, and to join the trade union. In the bridging visa conditions, asylums are not allowed to work in Australia until they are granted a proper visa. Therefore, if an asylum works whilst on a bridging visa, they are subjected to mandatory detention. Mandatory detention in Australia has had human rights issues for over a decade now. As discussed above, the current situation in Australia is still showing social inequality. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 30 says no one can take away your human rights, meaning that Australia immigration detention takes away many of these rights that everyone is subjected to in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, asylums do not get these rights, and the law treats them differently. Even the asylums themselves are treated differently depending on their situation.